Ever since Ahsoka Episode 3 Time to Fly released, I've seen much fan discussion surrounding the conversation about the Force and who can wield it that took place between Ahsoka and Sabine Wren. It answered the question of can Sabine use the Force through Ahsoka's definition of what the Force is and how it's used. Ahsoka says that the Force resides in all living things, and while everyone has it, it is talent, training, and focus that are the largest factors in determining who can wield it and become a Jedi. Some Star Wars fans are saying that this goes against George Lucas's understanding of the Force itself, and how he originally devised the concept for both the original trilogy and then Midichlorians for the prequel trilogy. But today, my dear friends, I'm going to show you why this is wrong. What Ahsoka said is exactly in line with what George Lucas said about the nature of the Force, and why Dave Filoni wasn't snubbing one interpretation for another. He was in line with what George Lucas taught. In the book The Making of Return of the Jedi, J.W. Rinsler recalls a conversation between George Lucas, Lawrence Kasdan, and Richard Marquand in July of 1981 during the making of Return of the Jedi, 2 years before the final installment of the original trilogy would release. Kasdan said this: "The Force was available to anyone who could hook into it," and Lucas responds, "Yes, everybody can do it." Kasdan then inquires, "So not just the Jedi?" And Lucas answers him, "It's just the Jedi who take the time to do it." So here George is reiterating what Dave Filoni had Ahsoka say in episode 3 of the show. It's also in line with Obi-Wan Kenobi's words to Luke in A New Hope, and Yoda's teachings to Luke in The Empire Strikes Back. Not to mention what various expanded universe authors also wrote. The Force was portrayed by George as a mystical and spiritual energy that was accessible to those who were attuned to it and knew how to use it as their ally, as Yoda said. That's why training was necessary to become a good Jedi. Simultaneously, George acknowledged that some are more attuned to it than others, some are more naturally gifted, and so in 1999's The Phantom Menace, he introduced a more biological and micro-scale scientific explanation of the Force through midichlorians. But Lucas made it very crystal clear, these were never meant to contradict his earlier statement about the Force, just added a layer of depth. Now Ahsoka gives a definition of the Force very similar to Luke in The Last Jedi, and because of this, I've seen a couple of outlets say that midichlorians have been quote retconned or fixed, or that Dave undid the concept. Not true. John and Dave still use the concept of midichlorians, as exhibited in The Mandalorian Season 2, when Dr. Pershing mentions Grogu's M count when discussing Gideon's cloning project. Filoni was well aware that this concept is George Lucas canon as well, just different layers of understanding, and the two work together to explain the nature of the Force within individuals. The idea of midichlorians suggests that the Force was quantifiable and had a biological basis. This shift from a mystical in the original trilogy to a scientific perspective in the prequels didn't sit well with some fans who prefer the more ethereal concept of the Force. But it's on a microscopic level, and I guess the problem for some was when Qui-Gon talked about midichlorians for the first time and the implication that M count alone determined your abilities within the Force. But that is not what George meant. He went back and stated it was an advantage, not the be-all or end-all factor. He said everyone has midichlorians, so in a sense, everyone has the Force. But those with enough of a low M count cannot wield it in the same way that a Jedi or even Sith can. And some fans think Hayang was teasing this. The standards Hayang talks about during the days of the Republic could be interpreted as Jedi only accepted those with enough of a midichlorian count, but there were some exceptions. In the days of the prequel trilogy, Obi-Wan was used as a good example. He was a Jedi Master who comparatively had a relatively low midichlorian count, and the word relatively is very important here, because it was still high, but lower compared to a lot of his contemporaries, and he almost failed his training under Qui-Gon Jinn. He worked and trained harder than all the other Jedi Padawans, and it's believed he was on the lower end of the midichlorian scale, to the point where he struggled a lot early on in his training. But he had the best master for it, Qui-Gon Jinn, who listened to the Force. And this goes back to Hayang telling Ahsoka that she comes from a line of unconventional Jedi. Count Dooku, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, Anakin, Ahsoka, and now Sabine. So you can apply both the original concept of the Force and George's later edition of the midichlorians to interpret Ahsoka's definition. I don't think Dave was trying to retcon anything here. And in the case of Anakin, which is the first time we hear midichlorians being mentioned, just because he had a high M count, it doesn't mean he could go without training. He had natural talent, as Ahsoka says, but if he had never been freed on Tatooine by Qui-Gon Jinn and taken to the Coruscant Temple for training, he would have just lived out his life as a slave. but we'll leave the nature of the prophecy of the Chosen One for a different day. In the case of what Ahsoka tells Sabine Wren, Ahsoka omits midichlorians, but they're still part of Star Wars canon. Everyone has midichlorians, some more than others, but ultimately training, focus, and how you learn to attune yourself to the living force, and commitment, which is what Ahsoka wants to see from Sabine, are the contributing factors to determine successful talent as a Jedi. But going back to this idea that just being force sensitive, just having the force in you, doesn't mean you have to be a Jedi, Ahsoka doesn't want Sabine to be a Jedi, she wants her to be herself, which I interpreted as Sabine freeing her mind of the obstacles that are preventing her from tapping into that living force. And with this whole context of George Lucas versus Disney canon, the explanation Ahsoka gives is fitting with the original understanding that George had of the Force. It's the same comprehension that Disney used with old Luke in the sequel trilogy, particularly in the lesson he gives Rey. The original trilogy left much of the Force's nature and origins shrouded in mystery. This mystery contributed to the allure and fascination surrounding the Force. Ahsoka is returning to that understanding in a big way. So for those who say Ahsoka reverses George's conception and nature of the Force, I don't agree. I think it fulfills and acknowledges it. I think the Ahsoka show, being in the line of Dave Filoni, is very much true to George's canon. Dave would never disrespect George like that. And I think it's very useful to have a character like Hayang, who's trained thousands of generations of Jedi. I'm loving the interactions between master and apprentice, the biggest theme of this show. And while we don't know what's in store for Sabine, we know she's going to try to use the Force again against Shin. Is it going to be like Kanan says, when she clears her mind? When she lets go of her emotions, when she stops being so, well, Mandalorian, for a lack of a better term, then maybe she can successfully use the Force. But I don't know if that's what Dave is going for. I've mentioned before I think Sabine really needs to find Ezra. I believe it's the biggest hurdle clouding her mind, her fear. And as we know from Yoda, fear is a path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And maybe when Sabine does find Ezra, if he's still a Jedi, which I think he is, could he be the one to train her further? And maybe as Jason Syndulla, Hero's son, expressed his desire to be a Jedi, maybe he too will be trained by Ezra Bridger. But as far as this scene goes, I loved it, and I believe it's in line with what George taught about the Force. I do not personally see it contradicting. With Sabine Wren, Dave Filoni's crafted her portrayal in live action very differently to animation, because she's at a different stage of her life. And I think all of these characters have a lot of weight, a lot of heavy baggage from their past. Their emotions are kind of all over the place, they're still just adapting to their dynamic as a pair, as master and apprentice. It's not easy, and I do believe Ezra is the thing distracting them all. And with Sabine, while she's not been able to use the Force so far, some say that her navigation through the Purrgil in the chase sequence on their way to Cetos was inadvertently her using the Force. It's an interesting theory, and Dave Filoni is someone who likes to put in these subtle hints, these crisscross, unexpected moments that when you rewatch them, you think twice. I think he's doing a great job, and I'm loving this show so far. I've seen in the comments you guys are enjoying it too. I can't wait for part 4 by Peter Ramsey on Tuesday. But with that said, my dear friends, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give me a big fat thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and if you want more videos not found here on YouTube, while also getting access to our Discord server and so much more, then click the link down below. That will take you over to my Patreon. But until the next one, guys, may the Force be with you, always.